start? Oh, perfect, yes. We need a microphone. Okay? Okay. Good morning to all. Thank you so much for joining us this beautiful Saturday morning from the center of the world. Because as many of you may know, this is what Delphi was regarded in ancient years. I am Nefeleli Geru. I'm a journalist from Proto-Thema newspaper. We have an exquisite panel. And we have a very interesting topic, relevant political issue. Can multilateralism survive? New global governance rules for a new world. I mean, multilateralism is under strain, at least, in an era of great power competition. So we will have the opportunity to listen to the speakers. Let me tell you, I need to be a little bit strict because we have a very limited time frame. So we decided that it's best to hear our speakers. They will have the opportunity to talk for 5 minutes each, and then we will have, it will be very good opportunity to interact with the audience and, you know, have the questions and so on. So let me start by introducing our speakers. I have Jean Pisani-Ferry, Senior Fellow at Bruegel. He holds the Thommaso Padoa-Schioppa. I'm sorry, you know, it's really difficult. Schioppa, okay?
It's difficult.
It's difficult. Schioppa Chair of the European University Institute in Florence. We have Miguel Maduro, Director at the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. Of course, George Papakonstantinou, Professor at School of Transnational Governance, European University Institute. Dr. Vladimir Yakunin, founder of Dialogue of Civilization Research Institute, Russia. Dr. Germany, oh, I'm sorry. It was, yes. Dr. Daniela Schwager? Schwasser. I'm sorry, it was extremely difficult for me. Schwasser, Director, German Council on Foreign Relations. And last but not least, our dear Domna Maria Michailidou, Adjunct Lecturer, Cambridge University, right? Okay. So, let me start. I think we need to make a special, because we don't have time, but I think that because we wouldn't be here without you and Professor Papakonstantinou. It was a seminar that gave the idea of this panel today. So I think that okay, you could talk just brief.
Okay, yeah, let me start. Thank you for having us. And true, I mean, there's 3 people from the European University Institute working on those issues, especially George and I, who are running a project together on this very issue of the future of multilateralism. So the question we may start from is the sentence of the leaders at the time of the London summit exactly 10 years ago, when they said a global problem requires global solutions. And the problem at the time was a financial meltdown, and it required common collective action by many countries. And there are many problems of this sort. There's the prevention part of the meltdown, which is financial stability. There's climate change. There's internet security, migration. So this world is replete with problems that require collective action. And collective action traditionally was based on the multilateral system. this multilateral system that was put in place after World War II, largely at the initiative of the US, with also the UK playing a significant role. And the idea was that we would have a system of global rules, common rules, with institutions serving those rules and with mechanisms, instruments to ensure enforcement. And that would be the rules of the game of this world. And it has served us well for several decades, with trade, with the IMF, with the World Bank, the collective action at global scale was organized through these institutions. And now, at the very moment where it seems that we need more, because we are confronted with a series of new problems, multilateralism is in crisis. And it is in crisis very visibly at the WTO, with a challenge, the US challenge to the WTO, the very transactional approach of President Trump, who doesn't want to be to abide by global rules, who says, I want to define my own interest. There's nothing like a common interest. I mean, some people in the Trump administration say this notion of a global community does not exist. There are only nations competing and nations entering into deals with each other. So this system is being challenged. And the question is, how do we respond to that? And the response of, largely the response of the Europeans is to try to defend the system that exists. To say we need a system of rules, we need these global institutions. We're going to survive the Trump administration. And so let's stay together, let's defend those institutions. And after President Trump is out of office, we're going to resume. The problem is that there are probably deeper reasons than the Trump administration for the crisis we're going through. And these reasons, they are partly geopolitical, the fact that the US is a significantly lower share, represents a significantly lower share of global GDP, that China is rising, that this confrontation of China and the US is going to structure international relations for the years to come. That's one reason. Another reason is that in general, there's much more multipolarity in the world. We are entering a very different world in which there will be several significant players, not one dominant. There are issues also with the diversity. We're in an extremely heterogeneous world. So we can go on and mention the various reasons. And the question is, to conclude, what type of conclusions should we draw from the state of the world? Now, in fact, a collective action hasn't died, and in a series of fields, there are new forms that have emerged, that are more flexible, there are more coalitions of the willing, they rely more on soft mechanisms, no hard law, no sanctions, no enforcement, nothing of this sort, but much more sort of a incentive, pledge and review mechanisms, etc. And the question is, can it work? Some people say, just can work, let's put the people around the table and let's, collect the good wishes and the intention of each. Does it work or not? And for what can it work? And for what do we need something more binding, something stronger? That's the question we want to put on the table for this panel.
Okay.
I'm the only one without a fixed, I don't know why, but there you go, without a fixed microphone. So let me pick it up where Jean left and say that what has prompted us to launch this project is what I would call the multilateralist dilemma. And Jean talked a bit about it, and I will pick it up from there and sort of speak of the different areas that we're looking at and which are, we think, very interesting. If you believe, as most of us, I would think, would, in a liberal, rules-based international order governed through multilateral institutions, and this order is under attack, and it is under attack from the US, which is explicitly saying it doesn't believe on the trade aspect of this order. It is under attack by a number of large countries which have a similar transactional approach to global problems. It is under attack by the fact that you have the China ascendancy, which claims to believe in this order, but through a number of projects such as the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, is not playing by its rules. So if you are, as we are, Jean and myself at least, Europeans, and you believe that Europe has a particular role in defending this order, but what do you do? Do you sort of continue the mantra of let's see how we can buttress these international institutions, or do you try and see in a variable geometry situation what seems to work and what seems to not work? Because truth be told, if you go beyond the trade issues, which are the classic multilateral setting, with the WTO and before that the GATT, institutions which set the rules, which are binding, where there is some compunction in terms of application of these rules. If you move beyond that into other policy areas, you see that it is a much richer environment, which was never really bound by the classic multilateral rules, and which is evolving very, very fast. And there the multilateralist dilemma is, do you try to go back, or do you try and pick which elements, which basic principles as you move forward would seem to work better? And let me illustrate this with a few examples from a number of policy areas. Let's take banking, international banking, and financial stability. It's an area where we've had a total meltdown the last 20 years. It's an area which does not have the kind of rules-based framework that trade has. It's an area where the private sector, it's a self-regulated area where the private sector captured regulation before the crisis through Basel II framework, and where we saw a total collapse. Now, we are now after the crisis. We have Basel III, the Basel III framework, seems to be working better. The question is it working well enough to be able to avoid the next financial crisis? Because here we have a classic public good, which is global financial stability. We have made a number of steps in safeguarding the system, but is the system safe enough at the moment? Is this kind of self-regulatory mechanism at play enough? Let's take another area, which is actually in the news lately because of the European response, the two minds in the European response to a merger between two large companies in Europe. That's competition policy and global competition rules. Here we have a policy field in which you have there is absolutely no international element, even though there's a lot of extraterritorial aspect to many of these competition rules. Somehow, until now, it has worked. You have independent competition authorities which operate with a kind of a common rule book, which tend to talk to each other and follow the same rules. And surprisingly, so does China until now. And surprisingly, so does the US, despite the new Trump administration. But here, it is the Europeans which are beginning to wonder whether the existing rule book as it is working properly or not. Let's take a third area, taxation. Taxation is a classic area where you have taxation is at the core of national sovereignty, right? So states have been extremely reluctant to give to any kind of supranational body any ability to write taxation rules. The UN has tried to do some work there, and there you've had a ad hoc body, the G20, driving a very radical and successful ending of banking secrecy worldwide, and using another international institution whose mandate didn't really have to do with that, which is the OECD, to present rules which, with the US at the forefront and using a big stick, got Europe to agree to them, and somehow within the space of 10 years we managed to end banking secrecy and do quite some work in terms of ending the issue of tax havens globally. So, and I could go on, for example, internet and internet governance, an area which is extremely important, the fastest growing human resource, and one which has developed in a completely decentralized way. The rules were written by private sector organizations. The epistemic community had a big role, played a big role in writing these rules. But now we're seeing that this self-regulated system is coming apart at the seams. We have issues of fake news. We have issues of security. We have issues of infrastructure, and we have no global body or no clear organizational framework to be able to handle this. Climate is another example. Migration is another example. So what we're trying to do here is to think through these individual policy elements with, as a background, understanding that they reflect the geopolitical shifts that are taking place, and be able to see whether there are general rules which are emerging, good practices and bad practices, hopefully to build on the good practices and avoid the bad ones.
Your points certainly are cause for thought. Should we proceed with Dr. Vladimir Yakunin? Okay.
Thank you. First of all, I am very grateful to the organizers of this conference to name this session. It's okay? To name this session the way it is named. And I would like to point out that the name is controversial in its substance. Yeah, in its substance. Why? You know, it was several years ago when Dialogue of Civilization Research Institute introduced the idea to replace the term multipolarity with the term multilateralism. Know what? Last year we had a special session on Rhodes Forum, and it was how to make multilateralism to work again. The reaction. A very reputable journalist in a very reputable magazine in Germany published an article claiming that using the term multilateralism, that is a pure sign of anti-Americanism. You know, I hope that nobody believes that this panel is anti-American. It is the panel to consider the possible structure of the political and economic global systems which we are talking about. I can put my signature under the first speaker claiming that is absolutely correct. I'm very grateful for that. But again, we should be very objective and we should know what we are talking about. When we are talking about global governance, it is very strange because as far as I'm concerned, I know only several global governing institutions. This is United Nations, this is WTO, this is, you know, in economy, and in financial sphere, this is FRS, World Bank, and International Monetary Fund. That's it. So when we are talking about global governance, it is better to talk about global governance rules, which was presented here. I completely agree. Who should define those rules? And how to make that institutional for the future, this is another question, and it is a very important question. We are talking governments, we are talking business leaders. Should we talk now about public organizations? Should we talk about the involvement of the social structures? I suppose this is the proper time to do so. And it is our idea to introduce the platforms like Delphi Forum, like Rhodes Forum, to involve more not only the civil servants or bureaucrats, not only the global businessmen, but to involve the organization of social kind, public organizations. That is, to my mind, very essential. Why? We are talking about private sector involvement. We were applauding Paris Accord, right? We were all, Americans, Europeans, Russians, we were defending this accord and we were claiming that Trump was committing a mistake, withdrawing from that. But do we know that the agreement to protect the environment, not to rise more than 2 2 degrees up is already a catastrophic scenario of development. Because if the temperature will rise 1.5, already part of Manhattan should be flooded with the war. So why we believe that was correct? It is not correct. Who is protecting this 2 degrees rise? Major businesses, major industrial companies. So again, it is needed for think tanks and for the organizations of different societies to deliver and to develop their own ideas how it should be done. It is not only terrorism, it is not only, political controversies, but we are ruining the world, the environment in which we are living, applauding something which is not already enough to do. So this is our message. And then we consider that the platform of dialogue is available, not for the states. I hear our distinguished ambassador, he agreed with me. When he is delivering his speeches, he is delivering as a representative of the state, of the nation, and he has his own rules, what to read, how to develop, of course, due to his, intelligence, he can make it extremely nice. But the actual dialogue can be committed only by the societies, representatives of the societies, not by diplomats are negotiating. So again, this forum, Rhodes Forum, should be the platform to involve civil societies into direct dialogue on the most essential issues of contemporary world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We could proceed with Miguel Maduro.
Yes, it's working. So good morning, everybody. I will present a slightly different angle, even if relating to what has been said so far. And my angle is the following. I want to discuss and address the extent to which there's a link between deeper and structural transformations on the nature of politics with the current challenges to multilateralism. And I will try to identify 3 aspects in which politics is changing, is being transformed, that have a profound impact on multilateralism and are helping or supporting, leading to this challenge to multilateralism. The first one is the increased gap between what we could call as the space for policies and the space for politics. There's a very interesting book that I will recommend to you if you can, from an archaeologist that's called At the Origin of Politics. And he relates the origins of politics with the Mesopotamian civilization and with the beginning of urban areas. So that's basically the first time that people got together, sharing a territory and some common resources, without being part of the same family or the same tribe. And therefore, they needed to develop rules, forms of resolving those conflicts that were not those that naturally flow from the family or from the tribe. And that was also made possible by the fact that that was the time that language developed as a functional tool, therefore something that could be taught to others, and that created a form of conversation. What I will argue is that today's, and the lesson that we draw from that is basically that what creates the need for politics is not identity, but is actually interdependence in the context of diversity. Now, and this is a common mistake that we do, to think that politics flows from identity. No, identity makes politics easier to develop. But the need for politics comes from the fact that we are interdependent and diverse at the same time. And therefore, have to find ways to resolve our social conflicts, to decide how we're going to distribute those common resources. What's happening now is that our space for interdependence is becoming bigger and bigger by reasons and examples that George has mentioned, but the space for politics remains profoundly national. And this creates 2 problems. The first one, it hinders the traditional mechanisms of political accountability. You don't know who is responsible for what in a variety of aspects. And therefore, that fact allows and facilitates political manipulation, in particular domestic political manipulation of international affairs or European affairs. That's one of the reasons why populists focus so much on international issues or European issues, because that's easier to manipulate in this context. The second consequence of that is that national political spaces that have not fully internalized the consequences of this interdependence naturally provide the wrong political incentives for actions at the multilateral level, therefore making those multilateral institutions or those integrated regimes such as the European Union more ineffective, and therefore creating a kind of vicious circle that continuously feeds itself in a negative way. So this is the first aspect in which this transformation of politics, this gap between the space for policies and space for politics, is basically bringing a challenge to multilateralism. The second one I will relate to a growth in what we will call transactional politics. This is something related to what Jean mentioned regarding this Trump administration, that basically says, well, the global order is basically nations bargaining between themselves. It's the art of the deal of Donald Trump, the book, the famous book, transformed into international foreign policy, basically. And this naturally, when you move from a rule system, an institutional-based system that is medium and long-term focus, into a logic of bargaining, you are questioning this multilateralism system. And what we see now is that this transactional politics, this bargaining idea, it's all about bargaining, everything is always on the table and you can't constantly bargaining, that is the model of politics that Putin and Trump developed, is now, for example, spilling over to other actors. It's becoming increasingly fashionable at the European level. The way that some populists behave in the context of the European Union is this same way. I mean, Salvini famously said during the campaign for parliament in Italy that if there are European rules that are bad for Italian families or Italian companies, we will treat them as if they do not exist. What greater challenge to multilateralism, to the international regimes, than this conception? If they are not good for us, then we will challenge and we will bargaining again. There is one mistake that they do, is that transactional politics may work in the short term first, and works when you have weight behind you. So I would assume and I would suspect that Trump and Putin, particularly Trump, can get some short-term results from this form of transactional politics. But I have many doubts that they can be effective for European states. And this is the challenge that we will have and the problems that we'll face. The third transformation of politics that, in my view, is interacting and helping, feeding this challenge to multilateralism, has to do with what I will describe as a questioning of the traditional editors of democracy. Democracy and in society in general, in order to decide things, we need information, and in order to have information, we need authoritative sources, sources of authority that help us define. We cannot be the ones that treat and decide what's true or false, what to believe or what not to believe with respect to all issues that we have. So we used to trust certain entities. In democracy, it was traditional media, journalists, it was political parties, it was trade unions. What we see now is an increased challenge to this. There is a consequence, I think, in part of the insecurity, the increase in inequality, and the backlash that is leading against elites, on the one hand, and the consequence to the fact that people have access to much more information than before, and therefore they think that they can themselves learn anything. So before you go to your doctor, and your doctor will tell you, well, you have this and this, and you have to take this and this, and you have to take these shots, and you will trust your doctor. Nowadays, you go to the doctor, and then you go back home, and you Google on the internet what the doctor tells you, and you start second-guessing. Maybe I shouldn't take this shot. Maybe instead, there are some people on the internet saying that I should take this and this. So this that we see on these small issues, we see at an even deeper level on politics. And this is helping feed this challenge against elites and supporting this backlash against elites. It's not only that you don't trust them, it's that you actually feel that you have the means to second guess them. And to a large extent, multilateralism in this context is simply a new form of elitists. It is at the international level those sources of authority that are also being questioning. So my final point is this one. These three challenges that we're seeing at the level of politics are contributing to this challenge that we see in terms of the multilateralism regime. And if we don't address these challenges to politics that work, if you want, at the upstream level, it will be very hard for us to protect the multilateral international order. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insight. I see the time, and it's really, we are in a very small time frame, but let's hear, it's your turn, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, and I'll try be short so we have more time for interchange. I can actually skip most of my analytical part of where multilateralism is these days, because I think Jean and Miguel have delivered a very complete analysis. Let me just add one line of thought, because what I then want to do is talk about political answers we can see so far. And that is that, you know, Jean, you mentioned the London Summit 2008, and you said for 10 years now we've been looking at this. I would go 10 years further back and argue that since the 1990s, we have been arguing, at least IR scholars have done so and economists have done so, we have been speaking about global power shifts and the trends away from the West. And we knew 20 years ago that in terms of economic weight, in terms of financial power, in terms of demography, and in terms of military capabilities, we see shifts slowly but surely away from the West that determine the structures, the institutions, and the rules of multilateralism so far. And there has been considerable political complacency not to react to this early enough. So what has happened in some areas is the emergence of alternative frameworks of, you know, competing institutions, and the most visible example for this is the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which, you know, caused a very fundamental debate in those who shaped the Bretton Woods institutions. Is it right to engage, or should we not? Is it right to try and have control over what is emerging in other parts of the world, or can we just sit with what we have? Now, if I look at the political debate, it has really gained pace, yes, after or with the repercussions of the financial crisis, which in my view caused a fundamental recession of trust in international institutions and rules. Not only the crisis, but generally the reaction to globalization, and now the understanding that we are seeing a revolution happening driven by technology, artificial intelligence, big data, and so on. But if we look at the way politics has reacted so far, it is an attempt to protect what we have. If you look at the debate in Europe, facing the challenge coming from the United States, the focus is mostly on when will we get America back again as the guarantor and, yes, the shaper of institutions that, in our view, always serve the US interest very strongly. And there really, at this point, isn't a very clear answer what to do. I would pick out one example where this is different, and we may have a discussion whether that's the right way to do. And that is the European Union's reaction to the US challenges to global trade order. The European Commission has issued a paper on the reform of the WTO, which essentially takes all the US criticism of the WTO very, very seriously, and really works its way through every single aspect the Trump administration has raised, and makes very concrete proposals how to accommodate this. I think to this date, there is no political answer to this, but on the working level, there is an engaged dialogue on what to do. And we all know that with the timeline for sending a representative to the appellate body, there is a real challenge for the functioning of the WTO. So this is one pathway the EU has chosen, and it shows two things. One is because there has been no real answer at this point, how dependent Europe is, of course, on a cooperative counterpart across the Atlantic. And the other thing is that it is only possible in those fields where the EU has actually transferred has full competency transferred from the member states. In all other areas, we see a European weakness, because if we first have to figure out internally who speaks for Europe, how we do it, and we don't have our own, let's say, institutional base and very clear rules for our EU internal way of working, in this case on trade, Europe doesn't or is not able to act as a shaper on a global scale. And I think the political discussion we need to have as Europeans, you know, listening to the panel and the trends you have showed, where basically the argument has been, yeah, we can leave it to other actors, we can leave it partially to civil society, we can leave it to corporates and so on. This is a retreat, in my view, of the ambition to politically shape the order we are looking at. And George, you mentioned the area of regulation of technology and the internet. I would say we have to be extremely cautious on that one, because what we see emerging in China is, in my view, not a best practice when it comes to the use of big data, the challenge of possibly cybercrime, data theft, and the protection of civil rights and privacy. So my call here is that we need to put our heads together, yes, in the old West, because we need to figure out what the norms and values and underpinning rules are that we want to put into this globally emerging debate on the future of order. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You are all wonderful. You are very respected of our time frame. And last but not least, our dear Domna.
Good morning. I'm not sure if this works.
Oh, you could take mine. Let me.
It
works?
Okay.
Oh, good. Okay.
Just put it closer.
Okay, thanks
Okay.
for this. So let me start with realization. And the realization I want to start with is that it's much easier for one to recognize the sources of our despairs than provide some kind of remedy and come up with viable solutions. So you might guess it right from this realization. What I'll do here is try not to provide solutions on how we go about combating this trend of reversing multilateralism, but provide a few points of concern with regards to its evolution and development. So there are two main points I would like to make, and the first is with regards to the distributional effects of what we're currently experiencing, and the second is with regards to the fast evolving geopolitics of the development of multilateralism. So the first one, the effects of the distributional effects of the reverse route of multilateralism. There is the predominant feeling, my impression is, that there are losers in trade, and the losers are not the ones that were previously left out. So there is a growing cleavage. There is a growing cleavage in individuals and in societies, and certainly you can identify this cleavage in the developed world, generated from globalization and its discontents. So this arises not similarly to what arose in the past, which was the view of globalization as a train that you either jumped on it or stayed behind it and kept waving at it. So a distributional loss in an international level, but rather in an intranational level. So there are two big rifts that are created within this cleavage. They have to do with education and they have to do with urbanization. So the rifts are the highly educated versus the less educated, and the cosmopolitan metropolises versus the declining provinces. The so-called everywheres and somewheres. The somewheres being the ones left behind in the declining provinces, tied to a specific location which they cannot diverge from because their income is completely contingent to the location from which they have developed their own life. So globalization and technological innovation rewarded within the past century metropolitan agglomerations of highly educated people. But these processes also devastated industrial cities and towns, the so-called effects of the premature deindustrialization. An interesting angle here could be that we can touch upon also later and perhaps discuss about it, is the compounding inequality resulting from the wealth effect attached to this cleavage. So the success of the educated here, they have rendered class advantage more inheritable. Basically, the distinction between income and wealth inequality, what Piketty really chooses to talk about within his work. And it's interesting here, and perhaps we can further discuss about it, the distinction and the evolution of what's happening in growing inequalities, both with regards to the stagnant middle classes, but also the centrifugal forces in the top and the bottom deciles of the income distribution. So second point I'd like to make, the complete change in the dynamics of geopolitics, and this is something which is more often discussed than the first institutional outcome. The defense of multilateralism is hard when some of its main pillars, and especially its founding pillars, this of the US, are leaning towards unilateralism. So the US today seems to prefer a system in which bilateral deals replace the multilateral rules-based order. To Trump's mind, multilateral institutions tend to strengthen the hands of weaker powers, vis-à-vis the US that is, and thus facilitate China's bid for global dominance. Hence, his solution, or my perception of his solution, is to destroy or at least diminish the global order as it stands, and then negotiate unilaterally with other countries on a bilateral basis. So this way, the US will ultimately hold the upper hand in all this and enable the developments and the way it sets the rules of the game to act on its own favor. But Trump, in my mind, is not the only threat to the current multilateral order. We have to see and investigate what other stakeholders have to say and contribute to this puzzle. So the Chinese President Xi Jinping has sought to portray himself as a savior of the current multilateral order, though his goal seems to not to defend the institutions that currently protect the whole system of global order, but rather bolster China's power. So an example could be how by deprioritizing human rights, he tries to pursue his own ambitious projects such as the One Belt, One Road initiative, which its ultimate aim is the economic influence throughout, China's economic influence throughout Eurasia and the East Asian Pacific region. But Trump and Xi Jinping are not the only leaders. There's a larger group of alpha, of macho leaders, if you want, that are challenging this Kantian logic of international order. We have other aspiring leaders in this group. We have Russians, the President Putin of Russia, we have President Erdogan, we have Modi in India, we have Netanyahu in Israel. And the rise of such leaders makes upholding the rules-based order increasingly difficult. So, and I'll try to conclude somewhere here, as geopolitical competition heats up, voters would turn even more to tough leaders whom they trust to uphold the very narrow national interests. Without an empowered multilateral system to police these abuses, countries governed by strongmen will increasingly break their promises, lie, and peddle conspiracy theories, basically the modus operandi of Trump currently. So to confront this kind of disorder, we need committed multilateralists to have a say, focus on defending and identifying here the most critical aspects of the international system. That means basically willing to play hardball against these alpha leaders, and the sample that we've seen so far, which is the response, the unilateral response of countries such as Canada, Japan, and also the European Union to Trump's trade folly, is an optimistic start, but I think that more remains to be done on this front. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. As I am informed, we have less than 10 minutes, unfortunately. So I think it's time to interact with the audience. And now we can hear your questions. Perhaps we could gather 2-3 questions in order to proceed as quickly as possible. Yes.
Is the right response to rising national populism more Europe?
to answer this question? Shall we?
Yes. Okay, then I'll also take the point made by Daniela. We're not speaking of rising populism. I mean, that's not the topic of this panel. The topic of this panel is how do we react to the changing world landscape, global landscape. And I think we all agree that this landscape is changing very fast. So I think the question for Europe is exactly, on a number of issues, we know very well that we cannot be players if we try to be players individually. And, I look at the UK. The UK is a very strong proponent of the rules-based order. I look forward to seeing what will be the role of the UK after Brexit in this regard. And I trust it won't be very significant. I mean, as Europe, we can have a role. We still matter a lot in trade. We matter a lot in issues like financial regulation. We can play a role in climate, although we're not the dominant emitter. But for that, we have to change the perspective on Europe. Instead of thinking we're just part of this global order, we're just one of these several incarnations of a rule-based system. So we have the global rule-based system and we have the internal rule-based system. We have to think differently. We have to think we are in a sort of a jungle and we want to contribute to structuring things and to avoid, disasters. And that means the external dimension has to be much stronger in the way we define the role of Europe. Now, can we succeed or not? The jury is out. I mean, we don't know. I think it's in terms of what Europe is about, it has to be a much more significant part of what Europe is about, but we may fail. And if we fail, our fellow citizens will conclude that Europe is perhaps not that useful. But I think in the next 5 years or so, it's vital to see what we can do. And I'm speaking of trade, we're speaking of investment, we're speaking of climate, we're speaking of data, privacy, we're speaking of internet security in general. I mean, there are very many fields. And we have to be clear about what we expect from Europe, and we have to be clear about the strategy Europe will be following. Is it a strategy of trying to rebuild the order of the past, or is it a strategy of trying to be a player in a different world? And I think we've got to be a player in a different world, and that's what we propose to work on.
Is there any other question? Yes. Yes, it's coming. Technical difficulties, but
you can argue, as some of the panelists have done, that existing institutions have let us down. Do we need to think of new institutions or different mandates for existing institutions?
Would you like to answer the question?
Yeah, I would be extremely reluctant to start designing new institutions because the politics isn't there. I would be much more in terms of seeing what of the existing institutions we need to preserve or change. I mean, we shouldn't dump the WTO. There's still battles to be fought through the WTO, but recognizing that the old WTO will never come back. So you're working with a club-like arrangement, you have to live with that. At the same time, you have to recognize that there are a number of other institutions out there which are working and you need to work with. And this is, just to respond to something that Daniela said before, absolutely, one should never think of sovereigns and collections of sovereigns such as the EU sort of abdicating their responsibility for the global order to civil society. No, because civil society does its thing and you have to listen, but you have to work with it. And you have to work with the different variable geometry arrangements which are out there. And I think data and privacy is a perfect example. You have a situation which is no longer in a self-regulatory sense, competent to deal with the issues that have arisen. And it's a classic example where sovereigns need to step in. And they are doing so increasingly. For example, having cyber ambassadors dealing with cybersecurity issues and all that, but in a different format in a classic multilateral framework.
Excuse me?
Yes, yes, of course.
I can argue here that possibly I cannot completely agree with this statement, because now we are facing somewhat absolutely unknown challenges. We are talking about IT technologies, we are talking about artificial intelligence, we are talking about genetic engineering, and we cannot give up the decisions in these fields only to the hands of Google or Facebook or some pharmacological firms. I suppose some kind of public institutions should be installed. So I completely agree that the existing institutions should be supported, maybe transferred to some new stages, but some new are of the demand because the world changed. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any other question from the audience? No. Okay. So I think it's time for us to have the last 1 minute each. Your closing argument. Are you okay with that? Or would you like to comment on something? No. Okay. Let's start. You just have 1 minute. I'm sorry for the pressure, but you see.
So, in 1 minute, what can we set ourselves as an agenda? I think what you said, Mr. Yakunin, on involving society, I think that's important. I mean, we're not in a game that's a purely a state game. I mean, we're not in a purely Westphalian world. In several fields, civil society matters a lot. But we cannot leave, and I think we all agree on that, we cannot leave the solution to this sort of, talking shops in which everybody will come and speak. What we've got to find is a right structure that combines the involvement of various players, civil society, companies, etc., subnational governance, and climate in this regard is very interesting, with what still belongs to the state.
Okay. Would you like to?
Yes, agree on that one. So I would like to pick up the question of how Europe can punch its weight globally in the shaping of the new order. And I think we agree on the fact that as soon as you have a common EU policy, it's possible to act as a global player. I think in a more general sense, Europe has to be aware of if we are in a world of great power competition where multilateral order is declining in its impact, power resources become far more important. And I would say this is not only for the transactional world and the immediate deals that have to be struck, but it's also true for the shaping task. So that leads me to the conclusion that one of the big tasks that Europe has to accomplish before it can punch its weight globally is really the internal consolidation. And it's a question of internal cohesion, it's a question of competitiveness, and yes, it's also a question of building up our capabilities in the area of security and defense.
Okay. Professor Costantino?
I'll be 30 seconds.
Yes. Unfortunately,
okay, I started by talking about the dilemma of the multilateralists to begin with. And I think, and I'll now tell you the answer to the dilemma. And the answer to the dilemma is simply, you keep the principles, you keep the basic building blocks, and then you see how they adapt to individual different policy areas, and you work with that. And if you do that, you'll find enough successful solutions to be able to maintain the basis of what is a multilateral order, but at the same time actually manage to have results and not lament the end of the order.
Okay. I think you have
1 minute in 0 seconds. I'll try.
Please
so
give us. No. Okay. Just
no. That's
30
fine.
seconds. No, you're okay with that? 30 seconds. I mean, it's only fair.
So, actually, very briefly to address the two questions that were mentioned. The first one, I think the big difficulty that we have in terms of rethinking the institutions we have is that the same things that render necessary those reforms is what makes impossible those reforms. And that's why I think we need to work at the upstream level and the transformation of politics taking place. Certainly, showing the capacity to be effective in solving people's problems is crucial. Because if democracies can't effectively govern, then you don't have a democracy. Democracy is self-government. It requires the capacity to govern. And one of the reasons why people increasingly feel appeal for authoritarian regimes is because they see that democracies are no longer effective.
Okay, Dr. Yakunin, just one word.
I already, I don't have any possibility, but I should...
I mean, let's be fair, let's be fair. Let's just give 30 seconds to, wrap it up. Okay, thank you so much.
I already pick up two questions here. And I picked up two questions here, and I am greatly supportive of the idea of more involvement of the representatives of civil societies in the creation of new reality and the new rules, not, to give up it only to the professional politicians. And besides, when we are talking about populism, I don't know any political party which doesn't want to be popular. So we are talking again about something absolutely different.
Okay.